Hello and welcome, I'm Oles Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Today we're discussing the outcomes of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine sanctions battle. The economic sanctions imposed by Russia against Ukraine may lead to a reduction in supplies of industrial goods to the Russian Federation from Moldova. Meanwhile, Canada is expected to expand sanctions against Russia in 2019. To go more into depth on this issue, we welcome to the studio Taras Kachka, advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Hello and thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
So let's start with the Russian economic sanctions imposed on Ukraine. They were expanded in the end of December, so now the blacklist, just to remind to our audience, the blacklist consists of the names of 567 individuals and 75 Ukrainian companies. So what's the effect so far in economic and financial scopes?
The effect will be visible during this year because this is another step. Just to remind that the first round of exchange of economic sanctions took place in 2016, and then it was it was introduced on the eve of December, beginning of January by Russia, and then counter-reacted by Ukraine. So this is about economic sanctions, and also the, let's say, security sanctions of economic nature are also surrounding this exchange of sanctions between Russia and Ukraine. And these sanctions are imposed initially by US, the EU, Canada, as you mentioned, and Ukraine as well. So in the end of last year, Russia not only extended the previous economic sanctions against Ukraine, but also added this long list of Ukrainian politicians to individual sanctions. And what we see here is two tendencies. First of all is that Russia increases the economic sanctions against Ukraine, targeting against Ukraine, trying to put as much damage or to damage as much as possible Ukrainian economy, whatever it takes. And another dimension is that Russia is getting angry about security sanctions of economic nature against natural persons and companies of Russian Federation. Mm-hmm. That's why Russia tries to retaliate yes, against Ukraine in this particular example.
But how do you think, how much damage can these sanctions bring to Ukraine?
I think that in macro level, talking about the economic damage in general, these sanctions will not damage Ukrainian economy because we already live in this kind of treatment for years, even for 5 years, because the first waves and first attempts to block Ukrainian trade with the Russian Federation took place in 2013, even before the Euromaidan and before the, let's say, actual war between Russia and Ukraine. So Ukrainian economy survived. It survived aggression, survived economic sanctions, survived this, let's say, almost cut-at economic relations with Russian Federation. It was surprising that trade with Russian Federation even grew during last year, because it means that the counter-dependence, these remaining elements of interdependence between Ukrainian and Russian economy still exist, and it will exist despite all sanctions. We will see how this, let's say, minor element of our external trade will be influenced. So the influence of new sanctions will be visible on the remaining trade. So, but in general, Ukrainian economy is quite competitive. On sanctions against natural persons or companies, it's a little bit different. On natural persons and then politicians, it seems to be only sanctions in the, let's say, PR or communicating on media universe. On particular companies, some of them are really exporting to the Russian Federation and depend on export to Russian Federation, but I don't think that for the moment there is at least a single company which towards which we can say that it depends 100% on access to Russian market. That's why
you talk about transit.
I'm talking about the list of Ukrainian companies which are sanctioned by Russian Federation. So that's for them it's also not a very, let's say, a matter of life or death. So
Well, Russia banned all the products whose country of origin is Ukraine. We know about this, but also it banned the products that could transit Ukraine. The delivery of these products to the Russian Federation could transit Ukraine, and this economic experts, they do emphasize that the Transnistria region of Moldova will suffer losses.
In this case, it's once again, so the primary idea is to punish Ukraine, once again, because Ukrainian transportation system is quite well developed, both railway and automobile transport as well. And these kind of sanctions actually damaging the services sector of Ukrainian economy, and the possibility for Ukrainian railway to transport cargo, so the shipments to Russian Federation, and the same for autocar, so automobile. And I think that it will be crucial for Moldova and Transnistria, but it will also be quite negative for EU member states, which still trade with Russia, and the trade between the EU and Russian Federation is also growing steadily within limits of already sanctioned and limited trade. That's why this is once again an attempt. So Moldova, Transnistria, and the EU member states are rather collateral victims of attempt of Russian Federation just to punish Ukraine and just to squeeze all trade flows to Russian Federation from Ukraine.
After this, could we expect further stronger cooperation with Moldova and with European countries towards imposing new and strengthening sanctions against Russia?
Ukraine and the EU are cooperating quite intensively on general sanctions. We are on the same line in terms of counteracting Russian Federation, in terms of how sanction policy can develop globally, because in WTO we are pursuing the same approach on sanctions, on, let's say, trade limitations justified by security reasons. So I don't think that there is a necessity to talk about new level or new intensity of cooperation between Ukraine and the EU on sanctions. So
we can stay on the same level, but I meant that you represent a diplomatic sector. How will Ukraine retaliate?
First of all, Ukraine usually retaliated absolutely in, let's say, similar way against economic sanctions. So these limitations on, for example, prohibition of export of new industrial products, it will be natural for Ukrainian government to adopt. Usually it takes a month between Russian sanctions and Ukrainian reaction to these sanctions, because it is quite important for diplomacy and for legal dimension as well. That this is not Ukraine imposing sectoral economic sanctions against Russia, but Ukraine usually reacts on Russian
This is a powerful
decision,
message.
because for Ukraine, we still believe that Russia is absolutely applies this economic limitation in absolutely unjustified matter. This is a case between Ukraine and Russia within World Trade Organization, which is under consideration of dispute settlement body, and we hope that they will issue reports in forthcoming months. So that's why we always react on this, not acting proactively, and the relevant decision of government will be adopted for sure, as in the same way as it was done previous year, so the beginning of previous year. On individual sanctions, Ukrainian policy also developed in quite different ways. So we have a legislation on sanctions, and we have a continuous ongoing work on elaborating whether we need to apply sanctions against particular natural person or particular company, the same way as the EU is doing or the US is doing in their respective policies. So here we are not talking about reaction to Russian decision, but we are talking about continuing constant search for the persons which need to be sanctioned due to real security reasons, real violations of international law, involvement of violation of international law.
I understand. Well, many experts, they do say and emphasize that in order to resolve this conflict, this war in the east of Ukraine, and in order to deoccupy the territory of Crimea, Ukrainians need to focus on rooting for strengthening these sanctions imposed in Russia. So this is one of the main tools how to resolve the conflict. Many experts do see this as the solution. Speaking of diplomacy on the world level, what countries are the biggest allies of Ukraine in terms of being the most easy and friendly to persuade that the sanctions should be toughened?
First of all, the U.S., so Washington and the administration of President Trump, they are applying the most efficient sanction policy, and they continue to increase pressure on Russian Federation. This is their key policy choice. Within the EU, the situation is a little bit complicated by the nature of the EU. It doesn't mean that we have a problem with the EU. It means that the decision-making process requires consensus among 28 member states with different position, different political choice. But we together with all member states are maintaining unity on continuation of sanction policy. And it's important to reiterate that the efficiency of sanction policy is also an important topic for discussion within the sanction policy. So for the moment, we have a broad consensus in the US, the EU, and also alliance states like Canada and Japan and Australia and some other states, that sanction policy should continue because it influences, first of all, Russian policy, and the second is that the sanctions impact is visible in long-term or medium-term perspective. Yes. That's why this is not a, let's say, short-term solution which need to be revised at 2 months or each 6 months. So that's why we are more or less clear on that policy. That's why I don't think that anyone can say that we need to wait for certain sensational decisions on rather drastic expansion of sanctions or drastic cancellation of sanctions. No, the paradigm, the approach was defined already during 2014-2016, let's take this period, and now our dialogue is more oriented on, let's say, greater efficiency of these sanctions, not about envisaging new tool, but about targeting new security threats. Like, for example, we are discussing the sanction reaction in terms of new sanctions against violation of international law and aggression and illegal use of force in Black Sea and Azov Sea and Kerch Strait, which took place in the end of November 2018.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick remark that this year we can also expect the expansion of Canadian sanctions against Russia. Ambassador of Ukraine to Canada, Andriy Shevchenko, said this. You mentioned long-term decisions and long-term solutions, and one of them, of course, are these numerous cases and lawsuits that Ukraine files and submits to different to the European courts, to international courts. What court does the Ministry of Foreign Affairs represents Ukraine in?
Ministry of Foreign Affairs represents Ukraine in 2 cases as an agent. So, and Deputy Minister Zerkalis and works like an agent of Ukraine in case on financing of terrorism and racial discrimination in the International Court of Justice, and a lawsuit against Russian Federation under UN Convention on Law of Sea, which is heard in Permanent Court of Arbitration by a specific tribunal, ad hoc tribunal established under Annex 7 to United Nations Convention of Law of Sea. This year will be quite important in these litigations, because this year we will have hearings on jurisdictional matters. So this is a first stage where Russia will try to present that these courts and these claims claims made by Ukraine should be dismissed totally because there is a lack of jurisdiction. This is a traditional approach of Russian Federation to limit application of international law. That's why Ukrainian key task is to defend the possibility for assess the merits of the case. And for both of these cases, it will be quite an important step. And we expect that in summer 2019 there will be, or even earlier, maybe perhaps in certain cases, we will have hearings on jurisdictional issues. That's why, and it means that in forthcoming months, so it means late autumn or end of year, we will receive judgments on jurisdictional matters where we can find, let's say, a final decision on hearings on merits, which will take place in forthcoming years. So these processes are quite long in terms of times, but these processes are important in terms of legitimization, in terms of strengthening our legal position in international dimension, in diplomacy and international organization, which is absolutely important in building, let's say, strong strategic understanding between our allies on how to, what kind of values to pursue and what kind of policy shall be respected by Russian Federation.
I understand. Well, I also want to remind the case that last December, in December last year, since then, we have a new case about Ukrainian sailors, 24 Ukrainian sailors being detained illegally in Moscow and held captive. They recognize themselves as prisoners of war in Ukrainian government. Also, I know that the case is registered in ECHR. I don't know about any other courts so far. Do they have the cases about Ukrainian sailors? But what is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs policy on that?
First of all, Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the very beginning, in the first initial note verbals towards Russian Federation, mentioned and underlined and put an accent on the status of our crew, that they are prisoners of war, and Russia should respect the Third Geneva Convention on international humanitarian law. And this approach is shared by all major allies. So in the end of December 2018, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, they issued joint statements with the same request to free our sailors as prisoners, since they are prisoners of war. So this is, let's say, a general understanding of their status. That's why, and so Ministry of Foreign Affairs absolutely shared the general approach of Ukrainian government in general, and also the in terms of lawsuits, since Ministry of Justice is responsible for European Court of Human Rights. Ministry initiated the proceedings in the Strasbourg court. At the same time, in the end of November, Ukraine added this element also to materials which are submitted to the mentioned arbitration under UN Convention of Law of the Seas. And this year, within this jurisdictional phase, this question also will be quite thoroughly discussed and assessed by members of Tribunal.
Well, let's see how the situation will be unfolding. Thank you so much for your interesting comments, and thanks for being a guest today in our studio.
Thank you.
That was Taras Kachka, advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Taras Kachka. Goodbye.